or by just settling directly out of the air. Some of these toxic air pollutants are of particular concern because they are persistent or remain in the environment a long time. These pollutants do not degrade quickly. Often, a cycle begins when a pollutant is deposited on the ground, then evaporates back into the atmosphere, is transported, and then deposited back on the ground again. In this way, pollutants can be carried very long distances. For example, toxic pesticides used primarily in the southern United States have been found as far away as Antarctica. People are exposed to toxic air pollutants in many ways, such as by breathing contaminated air, or eating contaminated food products, such as meat, milk, or eggs from animals that have eaten contaminated plants. People are also exposed by drinking contaminated water and eating or touching contaminated soil. Once toxic air pollutants enter the body, some persistent ones, such as mercury, accumulate in body tissues. To make matters worse, through a phenomenon known as bioaccumulation, predators accumulate even greater levels than their prey. This means that people and other animals who are at the top of the food chain can be exposed to much higher concentrations than those found in the water or soil. This process is particularly dangerous where fish are concerned. Nationwide, fish advisories have been issued for over 52,000 lakes and over 238,000 miles of rivers. Many of these water bodies were thought to be relatively pristine. However, EPA is now discovering that deposition from the air may be a major source of pollution in these water bodies. Right now, many states have advisories relating to fish which are contaminated with mercury. Toxic pollutants affect both human health and the health of the environment. When people are exposed to toxic air pollutants at sufficient concentrations and for sufficient durations, their chances of getting cancer or experiencing other serious health effects may increase. Depending on which pollutant a person is exposed to, these health effects can include damage to the immune system, as well as neurological, reproductive, developmental, and respiratory problems. In addition, a growing amount of evidence suggests that some air toxics may disturb hormonal systems. This can cause reduced male fertility, birth defects, and breast cancer. As mentioned earlier, air toxics don't just affect the health of people, they affect the health of the environment too. Like humans, animals can experience health problems if exposed to sufficient concentrations of air toxics over time. Toxic pollutants that mimic hormones, such as DDT, dioxins, and mercury, have been associated with decreased animal fertility, decreased hatching success, damaged reproductive organs, and altered immune systems.
Congress created EPA to protect public health and the environment. One of EPA's most important tasks is to regulate air toxics. EPA places limits on factories and other sources to reduce air toxics.
Before 1990, the Clean Air Act directed EPA to regulate toxic air emissions based on the risks each pollutant posed to human health. Specifically, the EPA had to identify all pollutants that cause serious and irreversible illness or death, and develop standards to reduce emissions of these pollutants to levels that provided an ample margin of safety for the public. While attempting to control air toxics in this manner, EPA became involved in many debates over which pollutants to regulate and how strictly to regulate them. In addition, there was the question of how safe is safe. During this time, EPA was still developing methods to determine the degree of risk involved with air toxics. While these assessment studies led to valuable information, regulation proved to be more difficult. In 20 years, EPA regulated only 7 pollutants, cutting annual air toxics production by an estimated 125,000 tons. While this was an excellent result, it wasn't nearly enough. Realizing the limitations of a chemical-by-chemical analysis based solely on risk, Congress adopted a new strategy in 1990 when the Clean Air Act was amended. Congress revised the Clean Air Act to require a more practical approach to reducing emissions of toxic air pollutants. This approach has 2 components: In the first phase, EPA develops regulations requiring sources to meet specific emissions limits. These limits are based on emissions levels already being achieved by many similar sources in the country. These regulations are known as MACT standards, standing for Maximum Achievable Control Technology. MACT standards are based on the emission levels achieved by the best performing facilities. In other words, if some facilities have managed a 20% reduction, then the MACT standard will be a 20% reduction. This means that all similar facilities will be held to the same standards. This keeps some companies from profiting by using cheaper, less effective control technologies than their competitors. Wherever possible, EPA writes the MACT standards as an emissions limit. That is, either as a % reduction in emissions or as a concentration limit that regulated sources must achieve. This way, regulated facilities have the flexibility to determine for themselves the most effective way to comply with the standard. After the MACT standards are developed, in the second phase of the process, EPA assesses how well these standards are reducing health and environmental risks. If necessary, EPA may then require additional controls or reductions. When fully implemented, all of these standards will reduce air toxics emissions by about 1.5 million tons per year, almost 15 times the reductions achieved prior to 1990. As an added bonus, some of these air toxics rules have the added benefit of reducing other air pollutants. To date, EPA has primarily focused its efforts on MACT emission standards. Over the next few years, EPA will continue to develop standards for all of the remaining source categories and reduce air toxics emissions even further. EPA anticipates that its technology-based approach will continue to prove successful at reducing air toxics. So, between these new standards and other continuing efforts, the Environmental Protection Agency is committed to reducing air toxics emissions and making our country a cleaner, safer place to live, work, and play.
Hi, our next guest is Ron Carbon. He is the 21st Century Partnership Director, and he's also the person who's really responsible for the forming of the Middle Georgia Clean Air Coalition. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you, Cherise.
Now,
Glad to be here.
Great. We always talk about, wanting a more livable community, but what are the real terms in being proactive for, initiating clean air in the Middle Georgia region?
Well, I think one of the most important things for the public to understand is that clean air is all about better health, because ozone causes respiratory problems in human beings and anybody that is an air-breathing animal on the face of the earth. Ozone has a detrimental effect on their respiratory capability. In addition, when we talk about the particulate matter, which is the second issue for which we are under non-attainment in Bibb and Monroe County, particulate matter causes heart disease and premature death, and there are numerous studies that show that. So when you start to begin to think about what is the impact, you really go back to what's the impact on the individual. And if you start to think about how, if an individual's impact, how does that impact the rest of the community, you revert it all back to dollars. And you look about if you can have better air, you can reduce the cost impact on an individual's budget. You can also help out the businesses from their perspective, because you have less lost work days, so you have a more productive workforce. We have plants from an agricultural perspective. You have plants grow better in areas with cleaner air. The ozone and the particulate matter impacts the growth of not only plants, but also the animals that we're depending upon for milk and meat and those kinds of things that are very survival. So we want clean air to help those things progress as well. Probably one of the biggest impacts from an economic standpoint, when you start talking about a non-attainment zone, is when you start to have to look at what it takes, what it costs a business to operate in an area of non-attainment. The fact is that history has shown that when an area goes into non-attainment, the laws require more stringent requirements for transportation planning, clean air treatment, programs on businesses. In fact, there's a Title V Clean Air Act permit that's required on businesses. Right now, that is 100 tons of emissions per year. Under non-attainment, that is reduced to 50 tons. So basically, half of the emissions now requires a Title V Clean Air permit. What that means is that when we're trying to replace industries like Brown & Williamson, and we're having companies from outside the area look at Middle Georgia for coming and locating, they see Middle Georgia as a higher cost area to locate in. So their business analysis and their equation isn't as lucrative in Middle Georgia. The other thing is that existing businesses are going to be required to upgrade their treatment processes and facilities so that they will also comply with the more stringent requirements. Consequently, everybody that's already here is already going to see their costs go up, and they're going to have to work doubly hard to make sure that their sales increase with their cost in order to continue to operate in the Middle Georgia area. So that has some pretty significant environmental or economic impact simply emanating from clean air, or the lack thereof.
Now, are we working on a timeline of how we want to get off the non-attainment list, or?
We certainly are. The state is required by the US EPA to create a standard implementation plan and have that on the books by 2007 with a mandated goal of attainment by 2009. However, I'm really encouraged to say that with the Clean Air Coalition and the efforts that put together by all of the people working there, that we're really aiming at achieving attainment and maintaining attainment well in advance of that 2009 time frame. In fact, there's some estimates that say that we can do it significantly in advance of 2009, which is all the better, because we'll all be able to reap those benefits that much sooner.
Well, I think we can be a success story. The initiatives, bringing all the different stakeholders and doing it on a regional level, it's just a model for success. But thank you, Ron, for coming in. And
thank you, Cherise.
Appreciate you.
Appreciate your help.
Okay, and I have his contact information at the end of the show, and thank you. Hi, not only am I your host for the Middle Georgia Clean Air Now show, I'm the director of the Middle Georgia Clean City Coalition. We are sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy. We have many great stakeholders like Davis Oil Company, Georgia Power, Flint Energy, the Macon Telegraph, the City of Macon, which are our diamond members, and a host of others who are really pushing clean fuels, item reduction strategies here in the Middle Georgia region. There are 2 clean cities in Georgia, one in Atlanta and one here in Middle Georgia, and we're just thrilled to be part of the partnerships and making things happen.